Hey everybody, welcome back to another tutorial series. In this one we are going to be painting this beautiful beach landscape scenery using watercolours. And here you can see the final painting that we're going to be working on in this tutorial. So I really liked this one because it has a lot of different elements in it. We've got the water, we've got this hill in the foreground, we've got the nice hills in the background and the beautiful sky as well. And I like how the water was going over the sand. Now all of the materials that I'll be using for this tutorial will be listed out for you guys, but I'm going to be using the Cotman watercolour set, my silver black velvet paintbrushes, got a few jars of water, tea towel. I'll be using masking fluid in this as well. But like I said, all of those materials will be listed out as well as the colours that I'll be using. The reference and the sketch outline is also attached as well. As you can see, I've already got my sketch outline down on my paper, and I sketched this out just using a HB pencil. You can directly trace the sketch outline I provided, or you can create your own sketch using the reference if you want. And I'm just starting off by going in with my kneaded eraser, and I'm just using this to lighten up that sketch outline so that when we add our watercolours, we won't see any of those grey outlines showing through. You want to make your sketch nice and light, but you don't want to remove it completely, so that's why I'm just doing a tapping motion with the kneaded eraser so that it just lifts up the top layer of graphite without removing the sketch outline completely. In this first part of the tutorial series, we're going to work on the sky. It's a really nice cloudy sky with lots of shadows in it. But before we do that, I'm going to take my masking fluid pen, and I'm using the Watercolour masking fluid pen. And we're just going to use this to preserve those highlights that you can see in the waves on the water for the sea. So I'm doing this first so that when we work on the sky, it will give time for this masking fluid to dry so that when we come to paint the water, the masking fluid is nicely dry for us. I like using this one because it's in a pen format, which is really convenient. And also it's a nice blue colour, which makes it really easy to see when you're applying it to the paper. A lot of the masking fluids come in a clear white colour or a grey colour, and they can be a little more difficult to see. So I really like this pen. And I'm just applying this wherever I can see those really bright glistening highlights for where the foam is being created for each of the waves. So look closely at the reference to identify where these areas of white foam are. And just simply use a tapping motion to establish this texture to your painting. And this just makes it really easy to keep these highlights nice and preserved, because we don't have to worry about getting any of the blue watercolour on these areas when we paint in the water. As the masking fluid dries, it creates a really nice rubber latex, which stops any watercolour from getting to these areas, and then you can just peel it off once you've finished working on that area, and the white highlights will be nice and preserved for you. And most of these highlights are very close to where the water is hitting with the shore, with the beach. You can see I'm doing lots of little sort of squiggles and little dots to get these in. Now you don't have to be too perfect when you're doing this. We're not trying to make this painting really photorealistic. You just want to get the impression of some nice glistening on the water and the foam for the waves. And to make this easier for you when you are going in and applying the masking fluid, you can include these sections in your sketch outline so that you know exactly where to apply the masking fluid. As you can see, most of my masking fluid is where the water is meeting with the beach, and then it gets less and less as we go further back and further out to the sea. So now that we've done that, it's time to start working on the sky. And we're going to be using the wet in wet technique for the sky, which is where you pre-wet the surface of the paper with clean water and then add in all of your watercolours. And so because you have to work on this layer whilst the paper is still wet, I like to mix out my colours first. The first colour that I mixed in the pan was cerulean blue hue, but you can use any nice bright pale blue colour. For the second colour that I'm mixing now, I'm just mixing up some ultramarine. And I'm mixing in a bit of Payne's grey, and this is going to be the colour for the shadows in the sky that you can see. Mixing in a bit more of that Payne's grey. So the first colour was the cerulean blue hue, and this second colour is a mixture of ultramarine and Payne's grey. But basically you just want a light blue and a dark blue, so that we can get in some of those nice light and mid-tone values and then some shadows to our sky. But don't worry if you don't have these exact colours. And I'm just trying to mix out a lot of it onto my palette so that we have enough to cover the whole of the sky. Now I'm going in with my large paintbrush. You want to use a large brush for this to make it a lot faster. And I'm just going in with clean water on my brush, just from my water jar. And I'm using that to wet the portion where the sky will be, so the top part of the painting, just that area. Carefully going around the hill line for those hills in the background. We just want to wet that top portion, so be careful that you don't add water all the way down your painting, otherwise the sky colour, the blue, could bleed further down into where those sandy hills are, and we don't want that. So just carefully wet just where the sky is. And make sure that you're focusing on getting a nice even layer of water all over the surface of the paper. Focus on the corners and edges. And the surface of the paper should be nice and glistening, but you shouldn't have puddles of water forming. Once you've done that, we can start adding in our lightest blue first. And what I want you to do is look at the reference and identify where those lighter clouds are, and we're going to keep those areas mostly white. In the reference you can see that the clouds is pretty much in the top left hand corner. So we're only going to be adding the light blue colours to these areas. We're not going to be adding any of the darker colours to this section. And you're just using that lighter blue to establish a nice base colour all over the sky, apart from where those really light clouds are. So as you can see, I've added that blue pretty much all over the sky, apart from where a few of the clouds are. And now I'm going in with that darker colour, and I'm just working this throughout all of the darkest areas of the sky. And because we're using the wet in wet technique, it actually makes this a really easy process. Because the surface of the paper is already wet, you can see that the colours just nicely bleed into each other and give a really nice soft out of focus look, which works really well for the sky in this case. I'm going horizontally as I apply the paint to give the look of the cloud texture. And I'm not blending anything out myself, I'm letting the colours flow and blend together on their own. As the paint bleeds out and softens out into areas nearby, you may notice the area becoming lighter. So you can always go in with more paint to darken up certain areas. And it's okay to keep building up more and more watercolour as long as the paper is still wet. If you are noticing that your paper is starting to dry and the colours are no longer bleeding out nicely and you're getting harsh edges, then wait for the layer to completely dry. Don't carry on working on it. Wait for it to dry and then re-wet it with clean water and carry on. This technique will only work if the paper is still wet. But don't feel like you have to rush because, like I said, you can wait for the layer to dry once it's starting to dry and then just re-wet it and carry on. So because I've run out of my dark colour on my palette, I'm just mixing up the ultramarine and the Payne's Grey again. This time with a bit less water because I want to get in some even darker shadows. So to make your paint more concentrated, just add in less water. And I'm just tapping this where the darkest shadows for the sky are, which is mainly in the upper right hand corner. As you can see, the sky has got a really beautiful stormy look to it at the moment. We've got some really nice range of values in our painting. We've got some really light clouds and then some really stormy looking shadows. And you can just keep tweaking and adjusting the sky until you're happy with it. Like I said, as long as the paper is still wet, you can keep tweaking and working on it until your heart's content. But remember to try and preserve some areas of lighter value. You don't have to add watercolour everywhere. It is okay to leave some lighter, more highlighted areas. Here you can just see a close-up of me adding in some of those darker shadows, and you can see more closely how the colours are just bleeding out and creating a really soft look. One thing you want to try and avoid is overworking it. I'm coming to the end of my sky now. I'm happy with how it's looking. And once it dries, it becomes even softer. I'm just adding in a few more shadows and a few shadows within those lighter areas of clouds. And so that is it for the sky. Wait for the sky to dry and then you can move on to the next part of this tutorial series. As you can see, the sky has nicely dried. It looks really beautiful and soft, And in this part, we're going to work on the beach and the hills in the background. I'm starting off by mixing the colour for the beach for the sand. And so I'm mixing up the colours lemon yellow hue, Van Dyke brown, and yellow ochre. So these are the three colours that I'm using to mix the colour for the sand. I'm mixing a darker version which has more of the Van Dyke brown. And really all you need for this is a yellow tone and a brown tone. And then to get lighter versions of the colour, just mix in more water. You can see that the top colour has a lot more water mixed in to make it really diluted. And the top colour had more of that yellow ochre and the yellow colours rather than the Van Dyke brown. Whereas the shadowed colour had more of the Van Dyke brown in it. And I'm just taking that first colour that we mixed up and I'm just applying this as a base wash all over the areas where I can see sand. So really easy step, we just need to apply this base wash all over the sandy areas. So look at where the sand is in between the green hills and also for the main beach. Now you can see that as the sand mixes with that water, there's this blue layer, especially where the sun is reflecting in that wet surface of the sand. So just before we get to the water, there's this nice blue colour, the same as the colour of the sky. So I'm not adding these colours, these yellow and sandy colours to this area just yet. Once you've added the base layer all over where the sand is, you can go in with that darker colour and just start to fill in where all of the shadows in the sand are. So look for the darkest areas on the beach and any little shadows throughout the hills. You can use quite a small paintbrush for this to get in all of those little details. And creating the shadows where the hills slope down. It's important to follow the curvature of the hills, how they sort of slope down. And I'm also going to add this colour just in front of where the water meets the sand. And we're going to start to add in our blue colours as well. So we'll be laying those blue tones over the top of the sandy colour. So you can see that I've left that strip between these two areas of shadow on the sand. I've left that strip where we're going to add our blue colour. So make sure you don't cover this area too much with these colours that we're adding in now, otherwise the blue won't really show through and it will look too muddy. So you can see that I really have preserved this area quite a lot so that we can glaze in some blue over the top to really make it stand out. So now I'm just going back in with that second colour that we used for the sky, and now I'm just going to work this colour over the top of the beach. As you can see, to give this really nice blue tone of where the sky is reflecting in the wet sand. And if you look at the reference, you can see that the colour is actually the same as the sky rather than the sea. It's not that sort of aqua blue colour, that aqua green tone. It matches the sky. So you're using the colours that you mix for the sky, which was the cerulean blue and the ultramarine mainly. And because we pretty much preserved this area and didn't add too much of the yellow ochre and the Van Dyke brown to it, that blue is showing up nicely and giving us the result and the effect that we're looking for. And this result can be quite difficult to achieve, so really take your time and don't rush it. Just mixing in a bit more ultramarine to give it more of a blue pop to it, to match the sky a bit more. And I'm just blending out that colour at the edges to give a really soft transition. And you can see that the further away from us that shoreline is, the sand, that blue is actually stronger, and then closer to us, that blue that we're painting is a bit lighter and it's not as strong. So I've tried to create that gradient in my painting. So now I'm going back in with that darker colour. Mainly we've just got Van Dyke brown on our brush at the moment. And I'm now starting to use this to go over the areas where there's actually grass. So I'm starting to paint in the hills. And I'm just using this Van Dyke brown to create sort of like an underpainting and just establish the tone of the hills. We will be layering lots of greens over the top in a minute. But for now, I'm just getting in the value, the basic value of that hill. The greens that we're mixing up are going to be sap green, which is a really nice sort of yellow toned green, a very yellowy green. And also we will be using a bit of viridian hue later on for the hills as well, which is more of a blue green and a stronger, more striking tone. But for now I'm using a mixture of that sap green and Van Dyke brown to now establish a base wash for all of the greenery, for the green hills and for the bits of greenery between the sand on the hills. Create those little patches that we can see in the distance, and we're again just creating a base wash all over the hills using this quite light colour, because overall the hills are very dark. But we're working light to dark, so we're going to start off nice and light with our washes and we're going to get darker gradually. There's no need to rush. Especially now because we're not using the wet on wet technique. So you don't have to hurry up and work whilst the paper is wet. So you really can take your time and be really intentional where you're applying your watercolour. We're not working on the hill in the foreground at the moment, we'll do that later on, so you don't need to cover that area just yet. Now I'm using a really nice small detail paintbrush to add all of the patches of greenery throughout the sand within the hills. And also at the edges of the hills where the hill meets the beach. Trying to transition between these areas by doing a little bit of a tapping motion. So now we've got a really nice base layer down on all of our hills. You can go back in if you notice that you want to darken up the shadows for the beach. You can return to areas that we've previously worked on to adjust them. So I'm just going in with another layer of the Van Dyke Brown, diluted with quite a bit of water. And I'm just building up some more shadow just in front of where we added that blue reflection in the water. And I'm just looking around the other areas of the sand and seeing if I want to darken up any other areas. And you may notice as you fill in certain sections and other areas like the hills, you may notice that the areas that you've previously done are too light, and so you can go and adjust them as you need to. So you can see that that is a much more accurate value to the reference. Before it is a bit light, and if you notice that the sand is a bit too desaturated and you want to make it a bit more vibrant, then you can always mix in a bit more of those yellow tones in with the brown to give it a bit more pop of colour. But for the moment I'm keeping mine quite pale. The reference itself hasn't got much saturation to it anyway. It's quite pale, it's quite stormy. But you don't have to follow the reference exactly. You can make your own artistic changes and interpret it how you want. So if you want to make the colours a bit more saturated, then go ahead. I'm just adding a few more detailed shadows throughout the beach. Especially where that area of blue is, just adding some brown shadows and details within that section. Mixing a bit more yellow ochre and water. I'm just using this to add a bit more detail throughout the hills. Still using that tapping motion and going downwards with the slope of the hills. And remember to switch up the size of your brushes according to the area that you're painting. If you're covering a really large area, then it's best to use a larger brush. But if you want to get in some tiny details, then make sure you switch over to a small brush so that you have the most control. So now I'm going to mix up a darker green and we're going to start to darken up the value for the hills. So now we're using that second green that I mentioned earlier. This is called Viridian Hue. And I'm mixing in a bit of Van Dyke Brown to darken it up. You can even mix in a bit of black to make it even darker. But basically we're just trying to mix up a really dark green tone that matches the reference. It doesn't have to match it exactly, just mainly match it in value. So it needs to be nice dark green. And I'm starting off with this large hill in the background. And you can see that most of the back part of this hill is that really dark shadowed colour, so I'm just filling in that area. But then it does get a little bit lighter towards the left part of the mountain, towards the front part that we can see. So I'm not adding a base layer of this dark colour all over this area just yet. Instead I'm going to mix in a bit of water so it's a bit of a lighter value, and then go and fill in the area so that it's getting filled in with a slightly lighter value compared to the back part of the hill. So there you can see it's lighter at the front and then it gets darker right at the back. I'm going to do the same process with this little bit of the hill that we can see just at the edge of the painting. Once again, it's really dark, sort of at the bottom, and then there is that small area where it's a little bit lighter. The base is really dark. Then the little bit of the hill we can see is that lighter green tone. You also want to use a nice small paintbrush to get in the little bits of greenery that we can see really far in the distance of the landscape. And so you can see why we had to just go up to the edge of the mountains and be really careful when we were painting the sky, because we could have easily got blue all over where the sand was, and that would have really ruined the look that we were going for, because it would have been very hard to remove that for those sandy areas. It wouldn't have mattered so much if we got blue where the dark hills are, because we could just cover that up. But if we got blue where the sand was, then that would have been really hard to remove. And I'm just going in with a little tapping, stippling motion and adding some little details with this darker green right at the base of the hills. Like I said before, just to integrate and transition between the hills and the beach. We're just going to finish off this section of the tutorial by going back in and adding a few more shadows throughout the sandy areas. Now that we've got in the dark values of the hills, it's brought to my attention some areas of the sand that could do with a couple more shadows. So again, I just mixed up on my palette the yellow ochre with the Van Dyke brown, and we're just going in and just establishing any of the shadows that I think need to go a bit darker, especially throughout those mountains and hills really far in the distance. Now, this is the time where you need to evaluate which areas of your painting you want to tweak, because there may be areas that I'm adding more shadows to that you feel are already dark enough in your painting. So judge for yourself what you need to change and tweak it until you're happy with your painting. I'm going in with some more of that dark brown, and I'm just going to start to build up a few more details throughout the hills in the distance. But really, I haven't got to do too much more to the beach and to the hills. And then we're going to be working on the sea, which will be a really fun part. Painting in that really nice aqua water. I hope you guys like how your painting is looking so far. Mixing up some more Van Dyke brown. Just adding it to the top of that hill. And you can use the Van Dyke brown to add any of the darkest shadows that you want to for the hills. adding a few more bumps and curves to the horizon, to the shape of the hills, to make them look a bit more interesting. But like I said, these are just little tweaks that I'm making for my painting that you may not feel are necessary to do for yours. But then there may be areas that I'm not tweaking that you definitely want to tweak in yours. So take the next sort of 5 minutes to try and critique your own work and analyze your own painting and see how you think you can improve it. That's a really important skill to develop in order to improve your painting and drawing skills, is to be able to self-critique your artwork, analyze what you think looks good, what values aren't quite matching right with the reference, and where you want to add a few more details. So I do encourage you not to just follow this tutorial exactly as I'm doing it, but make your own decisions along the way. Make decisions that are relevant to your individual painting. And then you can wait for this layer to dry, and I'll see you guys in the next part of this tutorial series. Now we're going to start to work on painting in the beautiful aqua sea. Let's start off by mixing up the colour for the water. And the colour that I'm using is cerulean blue hue. I'm also mixing in some phthalo green, and I'll be using Prussian blue as well. So those are the 3 colours that I'll be using for the water. So far I've just mixed the 2 first colours together, so cerulean blue hue and the phthalo green, to give this really bright aqua colour. And I'm using this as a nice base wash for all of the water. You want to add a little bit of water to the paint so it's not really concentrated, because this is just a base wash. So we do want to keep it on the lighter side, and we'll go darker and add shadows where we need to. I'm going right over all of that masking fluid, and I'm being very careful as I get towards the edge of that hill that's in the foreground. As you can see, I'm using quite a large brush because it's just a base wash, so that means that I can quickly and efficiently just cover the whole area of the water with the colour, whereas it would be much more time consuming and could give you patchy results if you used a small brush. And I'm going right up to the edge of where the water meets with the sand. We want to make those 2 areas look like they're connected and that the water is becoming part of the sand. It's a bit harder to see now where the masking fluid is actually covering because we've added blue, but you can just about see where it is. So see, now I'm going in with those same colours, the cerulean blue hue and the phthalo green. This time there's a bit less water mixed in, so that we can get in some of these darker, more intense colours, make it a bit more vibrant. As you can see, if you look at the reference, the water is lighter where it's meeting with the beach, and then it gets really nice and a deep blue as it gets further out, as it gets deeper, further out into the sea, it becomes a lot darker. So now we're mixing up that darker colour for these areas of the water by mixing in some Prussian blue with our cerulean blue hue and phthalo green. And Prussian blue is a really nice, deep, intense colour to really start to deepen up the waves now. And you can see that I am targeting most of this darker colour towards the back of the sea where it's further out, because like I said, that's where it's deeper, and so it's got a deeper blue tone. You want it to look darker where the water is further out into the sea, and then it gets lighter for the shallower areas right by the sand. I'm also adding a little bit of shadow around where we've added the highlights with the masking fluid, especially where the water is coming into contact with the sand and there's just that little sort of strip of foam right at the front, but then it is a bit more shadowed until it meets with that next wave where again we have the highlight. So you want to make sure that you are adding the shadows in between the waves so that where there is the highlights, they do pop when we remove the masking fluid. Towards the front of the water, towards the front of the reference, you can see that there is a bit more of this green tinge to the water in certain areas. So I'm going in with a bit of the phthalo green, and I'm just tapping this throughout a bit of the water to give more of a green tinge to a couple of areas. And this just gives the watercolour painting more of an interesting look. Just intensifying some of the shadows around the foam of the waves. I'm using the tissue to lift up the colour because it was a bit too dark. So using tissue is a great technique if you want to remove some of the watercolour. If you do make a mistake, if it does get a bit too dark and not how you want it to look, you can go in with a bit of tissue just to remove that watercolour. And that works best whilst the watercolour is still wet. It can't be done whilst the paper is dry. So I did a bit of the darker brown, and now I'm just using a clean brush to blend out that shadow to the rest of the sand. And once we have finished this layer, we can wait for the painting to dry, and then we will remove the masking fluid. Just going in and tapping in a few more shadows. You can see that when I'm getting in the details of the water, I'm once again doing it in horizontal brush strokes to go with the flow of the waves. They're very horizontal as they're splashing onto the shore. So I want to make sure that I'm doing my brush strokes going with the direction rather than against it to enhance the look. Because even though we're not going for realism, we still want to give a realistic impression of each of the elements in our painting. Mixing up an even darker blue. So once again, more Prussian blue. You can even mix in a bit of Payne's grey, which we use for the sky. And this is just a nice dark, intense bluey grey, which is great for darkening up your blue tones. So Prussian blue and Payne's grey would give you a really nice deep blue. And I'm just using this to really intensify the shadows of the water where the sea is nice and far out. especially in the distance, more towards the hills in the background. It's a really intense blue in those areas. I'm also filling in the gaps between the highlights on the waves. There's shadows in between those areas. So even though we have got masking fluid in the areas of the highlights, try and imagine them as being white so that you know what the values around those areas should be, so that you're filling in all of the little bits of shadow in between those foamy highlights for the waves. Mixing in a bit more phthalo green into those shadows so that we can get in some shadows further towards the front of the sea, where I said it has got a bit more of a green tinge to the water. I'm going to use a clean damp brush just to blend out those edges so that we can avoid any harsh edges between our layers of watercolour. And that is pretty much it for our base layer of water on the sea, our base layer of watercolour. And then all you need to do is wait for this to dry. And then I'll come back to talk you through how to remove the masking fluid. I'm just finishing off by going in with some more green mixed in with my blue, just to add in a few final shadows. But once you're happy with how the water looks, wait for it to dry, and then we'll go in and remove the masking fluid. Now my layer is nice and dry, so I'm going in with an old tea towel. As you can see, this cloth has got some nice texture to it, which makes it really easy to remove masking fluid with this tea towel. So I'm just using it to go in circular motions and rub off all of the bits of masking fluid. And as you can see, we're revealing some really nice bright highlights. You can use your finger, but I find that this method is much more effective if you use some sort of textured cloth. But be careful, because different watercolour paper is different and acts differently, so be careful that you don't go too aggressive and tear your paper. Just make sure that you remove all of it. If there's stubborn parts that are hard to remove, you can go in with an eraser like I just did, and that tends to help remove any little bits of masking fluid that are just sticking to the paper and being really stubborn and won't come off. But overall, the cloth does a decent job at removing most of it. I have found though that this pen sometimes does tend to stick a bit more than other masking fluids, and leave little bits of residue on the paper. But that eraser really does help to get off all of the little bits. Make sure your paper is completely dry before you remove the masking fluid, otherwise the watercolour will just smudge everywhere and it will make a real mess. One way that you could quicken up the process of drying your paper is using a hairdryer or a heat tool. I recommend putting it on a cool setting, and that really does speed up the drying process and can have your paper dry in a few minutes. So I love using that when the paper isn't too wet, so I can just go in for a few minutes with the hairdryer on a low heat setting and just dry it out that way. And now, because some of these highlights are really stark and really bright, I'm just toning down some of the edges with a very diluted wash of the blue that we've been using for the water, just tapping that mainly on the edges of the highlights where it's meeting with that dark intense colours for the water. I'm leaving the brightest highlights white right at the front. At the front of those waves, it's the brightest. And then as it trails off and there's not as much of the sea foam as it gets further back in towards the sea, that's where I'm glazing over some of the blue. So that only the fronts of the waves are that really bright white colour. You don't want to keep all of these areas as bright white. It's okay to go and glaze some of the blue over some of them. Keep it diluted. We still want them to be more highlighted than the rest of the water. It's okay to tie them in with the rest of the water a bit more. And you can go in and tweak and add shadows now that you can more easily see the values for the sea foam. But that's it for that part of the tutorial series. And now we're going to move on to finishing off this painting by just getting in the hill in the foreground. And because this hill is in the foreground, it's right at the front, we can see a lot more detail. And we're going to start off by creating the little sandy path in the middle of the hill. And I just mixed up the exact same colours that we used for the base wash of the sand in the other areas. So the yellow ochre and the Van Dyke brown mostly with some water. And I'm just covering that whole sandy path with a base wash of this really light sandy colour, just to establish where it is. Now I'm going in with the Van Dyke brown to now get in some of the shadows. Mix it in with a bit of that yellow ochre, that first wash. And we're just going to establish a bit of texture, a bit of detail within this sandy path. And getting the shadows around the edges, leaving it lightest in the middle of the path, but creating some shadows where the sand meets with the greenery and the grass on the hill. Blend it out with a clean brush if you've got any harsh edges. And I'm reactivating that green that we used for the hill earlier on, mixing in some more sap green and some water. And we're going to use this colour to add a nice base wash and a nice base coat and underpainting all over the greenery for the hill. So basically everywhere but that sandy path that we just got in. You can see that I've switched over to a larger brush to make this faster. Being very careful as I get to the edge and as I meet with the sand. And just establishing that base layer. Keeping it really nice and light. We can always go darker, but it's very hard to remove paint when you're working with watercolours. So I always like to take it really nice and slow and steady. Now I'm going to repeat the process for the other side of the hill. Filling it all in. Now we've got a really nice base layer down really quickly for the hill and for the sand in the middle. It makes it a lot easier to go and build on top all of the details and texture that we need to. Now I'm going in with some more sap green, just with a little less water mixed in, so it's a little bit darker. And I'm going to go and establish all the values that are slightly darker. We're gradually going to get darker and darker. I'm also tapping in some Viridian hue, mixed in with some Van Dyke brown, to start to tap in and establish the darker shadows and give a bit of texture to the hill. It's very bumpy, there's lots of patches of different types of grass and foliage. So you can see that I didn't even fully mix the colours together because I want some areas to look a bit more of a vibrant green and have a bit more of the brown showing in certain areas. And you can get that really interesting look by not really fully mixing the colours together. I really am utilising a tapping motion when I'm doing this process so that we are still having areas of lighter value. We're not covering them all in with this darker colour. And doing a tapping motion also gives us a very natural texture for the foliage and gives us that bumpy, patchy look. I'm also doing some tapping where the grass is meeting with the sand to naturally integrate those two areas so it's not just a direct cut-off point between the sand and between the greenery. We want it to look like they're gradually fading out and gradually shifting between each other. Mixing in some more Van Dyke Brown with the Viridian Hue. And we're going to go even darker now. Looking carefully at the reference. Just painting in the darkest areas with this colour. And as you get darker and darker with your colours, you'll be applying them naturally to less and less areas. Because we're only using this colour for the darkest sections. You don't want to cover all of the greenery in with this really dark colour because then you lose it. It all becomes just one value. And it will make it harder to paint in little details of grass over the top because they won't show up as much. I'm just continuing to go in and tap in some of the shadows. Mixing in some more Van Dyke Brown and Viridian Hue, still mixing the same colours, just getting less and less water mixed in to make it darker. And that's all you have to do to get a darker colour, is just mix in less water. And if you want a lighter wash, just mix in more water. So you can adjust and control the value of your paint just by mixing in more or less water, and you can effectively get loads of different colours just from one colour by the varying amount of water that you do mix in. I'm now going to intensify the colour for the sand. I mixed in a bit more yellow so we can have more of a vibrant tone, so I mixed in a bit more of that yellow ochre, and I'm using a small brush to do a stippling motion to get in this more vibrant colour. And then once you've done that, wait for that layer to dry. As you can see, the hill and that sandy path is now dry because we're going to start to build up another layer and start to build up more detail in the hill. And to do that, to add in details like the grass, you need to be working on dry paper, otherwise it will start to bleed out. So I'm going in with a sponge and I dipped it into the paint, and a old washing up sponge is what I'm using, and it's great for adding foliage texture to your watercolour paintings. It gives a really natural, realistic look. And I just used it to create that little bush that you can see behind the hill. Just going in and layering a bit of a darker green over the top to add a variety in the values. And you can go in with your brush to tap in some darker shadows if you want to, if you want a bit more control. But I love the randomness the sponge gives. You can't really predict it, and so it doesn't look too uniformed. It gives some really nice natural scattering of the foliage leaves. It's great when you want to do some sort of expressive landscape painting. because it gives the impressions of leaves without you having to paint in every single one. Now going in with some sap green, and I'm just going to use this with a very detailed small brush, and as you can see I'm just doing lots of little lines going upwards to create the look of grass and to create that grassy texture. And as you can see, the details are really easily showing up over the top of those really light areas, and that's why we didn't add a really dark colour to every inch of the hill. We left some areas lighter so that when we do go in and paint in some details, we can actually see them. Because if you go a bit too dark, then when you do get to the stage where you want to add details, they just won't show through because watercolours are so transparent. I'm starting on the right side of the hill, and as you can see I mainly am just going vertically upwards, and I'm trying to crisscross them as well so that they are overlapping a little bit to give it more of a natural look. And I'm trying to add a little bit of curvature to the blades of grass. I'm not doing them all going straight up and not overlapping at all because that can look very uniformed. I'm trying to add a bit of randomness by doing some thicker, some thinner, some longer, some shorter, and to go in slightly different directions. Even though they are going all upwards, tilt them slightly, make them a bit more curved, crisscross them so that it doesn't look so rigid, so that it looks a lot more natural. And I'm doing the same process now on the left hand side, and I'm making sure to do some little blades of grass that are going over into that sandy path to again give a natural transition to avoid making it look like there's just a harsh cut-off point. And I'm curving them nicely over into that path to give a really nice natural look. And you can see that I am using quite a diluted wash of green. And so as these details do dry, they will become less visible. And so I'm just going to go throughout the rest of the hill and just continue to repeat this process till I've covered the whole of the hill. And just remember those tips that I just gave you to do it different lengths to make the blades of grass different lengths, some longer, some shorter, some thinner, some thicker, some of them curving slightly to the left, some curving slightly to the right, and to make sure they crisscross over each other and overlap. And those are the things that you need to follow if you want your grass to look really natural. And so I'm just going to repeat this process for the next few minutes, and then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. Now that I've added in a first layer of details with that really diluted green, I'm now just going to do exactly the same process but with a darker shade of green. Now we're building up the layers, and so I mixed up the Viridian Hue. As you can see, you can mix it with some Van Dyke Brown or some black if you want to make it really dark, and you just want to repeat the process to create some details that are more visible. The other ones were really subtle blades of grass, and we can create some nice depth within our hill by working in layers and getting in multiple layers of these details. Also, you can see in the reference that it's a big mix of different types of grass. There's thick grass, there's even just sections and clumps of foliage. So I'll also be going in with my sponge and just tapping that throughout the hill to give the look of those masses of foliage, those sort of mini bushes within the hill. And we've got some really thick areas of grass, some sort of thick blades and weeds. We've got some bits of corn and wheat going over onto the water. So we've got lots of different types of greenery, foliage, plants that we can get in. And that first layer of details was just a base layer, just establishing some texture. As you can see, I'm mixing up a really dark green with those two colours and using my sponge just to tap in some detail, getting some texture. You don't have to copy the reference exactly, just be expressive with it. You just basically want to add a lot of detail and texture to the hill by using the sponge and also by adding individual blades of grass using your paintbrush. Also, we will be adding in some blades of grass over the top of all of this, some lighter blades of grass, by mixing in our watercolour with a bit of white gouache. Now this will be an optional step because not all of you will have gouache. I only ever use a white gouache, and I find it really handy because you can use it to add the brightest highlights, the really white highlights, and also you can mix it in with a bit of any watercolour to get light variations of those colours, so we can create a really nice light green that will be really opaque and will go over the top of darker shades of watercolour. So even if you didn't preserve your highlights in your watercolours, you can go in and get some nice details and highlights by mixing in a bit of gouache with your watercolour to make it more opaque. That's a little tip that I like to use. Though you may not like it if you want to work purely with watercolour, but I don't see the harm in utilising all of the materials and resources that we have at our disposal. I'm a big fan of mixed media. You can see I'm just using my small detailed brush to just get in lots of detail within this hill. Getting in some really dark, intense shadows, but I don't want to cover up every area with dark shadows. So make sure that you're focusing on the reference and looking at where the darkest shadows are, that you are being intentional with your details and where you add your dark shadows, because once again, you don't have to rush this part. We're working on dry paper, so you can take the time to really evaluate your reference and figure out where you want to add your shadows. Once again, painting in lots of blades of grass like we did before, following those same rules that I taught you guys about earlier, about how to paint the blades of grass. Making sure to add lots of individual blades of grass over the edge of the hill, because there will be these blades of grass that are going over onto the water, over onto the beach, and you don't just want your hill to look like it just cuts off, because this is a very natural hill. It's not being like mowed or anything. There are going to be these longer strands and blades of grass that are going over onto the beach, overlapping, and it's going to look quite wild. So you want to give it a nice wild look in your painting. So once again, I'm just going to continue for the next few minutes to build up the rest of the details, the blades of grass and the foliage using the sponge with these darker green tones, making sure to add some blades of grass going over onto the sandy path. So once again, keep that a nice natural transition. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. Now it's time to go in with our gouache and work on adding in all of those little highlights that I was talking about earlier. So I've got some purple, and this is the shade mauve, onto my palette, as you can see in the bottom left of the palette. And I'm mixing up some white gouache on the pan next to it. And I'm using the Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache in the shade Permanent White. And I'm just taking some of that white gouache that's on my paintbrush and just mixing it into that purple. And now we'll need to add more purple watercolour in with this, because we're trying to make it a nice light purple. And we will be doing the same with the green, so I'm just prepping that section of the pan by adding some white gouache in with the green. So we're going to make a light green and a light purple to add in some details, because if you look at the reference you can see that there are some shades of like lavender on the hill, some little bushes. So I'm going to add them in, and of course I'm going to add lots of light coloured grass with the pale green. But you could leave it at this sort of stage if you prefer, if you don't want to add in the gouache. I'm going to mix in my mauve, so it's just a bright pinky purple called the shade Mauve from my Cotton watercolour set. Mix that in with the white gouache at the bottom. You can mix in any purple shade that you have, and it will look a nice pastel colour. If you're new to this technique and you don't know what it will look like once it's applied to your painting and you're scared to go in and ruin it, then you can always test it out on a scrap piece of paper first and wait for it to dry. Maybe paint a layer of dark green on your scrap piece of paper and then wait for that to dry and go in and add these colours that you've mixed up, so you can see if you like the result, and then you can tweak the amount of gouache that you want to add in, or the purple and green. So don't feel like you have to rush straight in with your painting. If you want to experiment a little bit first with the amount of water that you're mixing in and the amount of colour and gouache, then do all of that and experiment on your scrap piece of paper until you get a consistency that you like, and then you can go and paint in all of the grass on the painting. Because if you mix in too much water to your gouache, then even though it will look nice and bright when you put it down, it will dry quite transparent. So you don't want to mix in too much water. And if you add in too much white gouache, then the colour will be really pale. And so they might just look like white highlights, whereas really you want them to look like light green and light purple. You don't want them to look white. So make sure you mix in enough watercolour as well. I'm mixing in some Viridian Hue into my white gouache. And also, if you don't mix in enough white gouache, then it won't be opaque enough. And so it won't stand out over the top of your darker layers of watercolour. So there's 3 different things that you need to monitor: the amount of water you're adding, the amount of white gouache, and the amount of the different coloured watercolours that you're using. So it's worth experimenting with. And I'm first going in with this lavender colour, and I'm just tapping that on with a sponge where I can see lavender in the reference. And as you can see, it gives these really beautiful results. It gives a really lovely look of a nice purple bush at the front of that hill. Now I'm going in with the light green with a really small detailed brush. I've noticed that it's not got enough white gouache in, so I'm just mixing in a bit more. So I'm tweaking as I go until I get the perfect result, because when I was painting it in just then, it wasn't really showing up. Whereas now, as you can see, that's so much brighter. We can definitely see those highlights. They look really nice. And I'm mainly going to add these to the left-hand side, where you can see that big cluster of really light blades of grass. And this is a great way to add all of the grassy details if by accident you went in and added too much of your darker watercolours. I'm also using this to add in the little bits of crop going over onto the water, so the wheat. And it's mainly on the right hand side, right in the bottom corner. Once you've painted in your wheat, you can go throughout the rest of the hill and just add in all of the little blades of grass. I'm using a really small detail paintbrush for this, and they just show up so well. I love using this technique with watercolours. Take your time. Really, it's just a time-consuming process because you're just doing the same thing just throughout the whole of the hill. So it will take some time, but there's nothing really more for me to explain about the technique and the process because I'm applying the paint exactly the same as I did when I did the other layers of grass, following those same principles. Try not to go overboard with it. You don't want to add too many highlighted strands of grass. Just add a few all over the place. But don't feel like you need to cover every inch of the hill with these lighter blades of grass. Adding bits of grass going over onto the sand, and you can see how now by adding in all of these details, all of these blades of grass going over towards the sandy path, you can see how it looks like they transition very nicely between each other. I'm adding some of those thick blades of grass right at the front. And like I said, I will be focusing on adding most of these lighter blades of grass to the left-hand side of the hill, because that's where we really can see quite a lot of them. And they are quite thick, so I'm making sure to replicate that in my painting. We will be going in with the white gouache as well and adding a bit of highlight to the water. What I want to do is transition between where we've had the masking fluid into the rest of the water a bit more and add a bit of individual specks of highlight to the water where it's glistening. That's what we'll be doing in a minute. Once we've gone in and added in all of our blades of grass, so once again, I'm just going to spend another minute or two just finishing off this step, and then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. I am also going to repeat the same technique as I did with the lavender and just get a bit of this green on my sponge and use it to tap in a bit of foliage throughout the hill to add even more texture to our hill. You can see it's looking very textured now, which is great. And I'm also going to go in with the sponge and actually add a bit of this light green to the hill in the distance. I want to add a bit of lighter texture to that hill. Just going in with a small detail brush. And the brush is quite dry so that we can just rub it over the paper and use the paper texture to help add texture to the hill. Because I'm using cold pressed paper, it naturally has quite a lot of texture to it. So if you have quite a dry brush, you can just wipe that brush over the surface of the paper with a bit of paint on it, and it will get picked up on and sort of show off the texture of the paper to give a really interesting effect. So this will only work if you keep your brush really dry and don't mix in too much water into your paint. Now to finish off, we're going in with pure white gouache, and like I said, we're just going to add a little bit of extra highlight to the water just to transition from where we've used the masking fluid into the rest of the water, to add a bit more sparkle in certain areas. Again, I'm using the dry brushing technique so that the paint gets picked up on the texture of the paper and it shows through that texture to give that natural look of glimmer and sparkle. Really helps to give that texture. You don't want to go overboard with this. And once again, this is an optional step which you can miss out if you don't feel like it's necessary for your painting. I'm adding a little bit of detail where the water hits the shore. A few more details right at the front. But here you can see the final result of this tutorial. I really hope you guys enjoyed following along with me and like the result that you got. Wait for it to dry so that you can see if you need to add any more gouache and details. And here's again a close-up of all of those little details that we've created. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next tutorial.